Hello, welcome back to all of the Street Fighters, and welcome to the PlayStation 2. This is the first Street Fighter game that we've looked at so far, which is a PlayStation 2 game. We're playing a PlayStation 2 disc. Now, I have to admit, there's some weird visual issues in my footage for this video. I've done a pretty crummy job of capturing the footage. The reason for that is my PlayStation 2 that I own is broken. So I've had to emulate the game. I own the disc, as you can see here. I'm not pirating the game. I've put the disc inside my PC and I'm running it through an emulator called PCSX2. So it's a real copy of the game, but try as I might, I cannot fix these visual bugs. So the two things you'll notice is, number one, the worst thing is this weird ghosting at the bottom of the screen, where it's kind of a repeat, kind of semi-transparent version of the footage, which is kind of overlaid. That's really crap. I apologise. Hopefully you can see through that. And the other thing, which is slightly more humorous but still annoying, anything that was rendered using cloth physics in the game, so skirts, belts, I think Vega's ponytail possibly, anything that uses cloth physics totally just isn't rendered in the emulator. So if you see Sakura, she's got no skirt on. That's not just me being creepy. It's just the emulator. Ryu and Ken's belts, like the tassel on their belt, just totally non-existent. So yeah, that's a bit disappointing. Apart from that, it does mean that I've been able to run the game at a slightly higher resolution than the PS2 supported, so the footage does kind of look better for that reason. But yeah, apologies for the crummy job I've done of the footage. But I didn't let bad emulation ever stop me before. So let's look at Street Fighter EX3. This came out in the year 2000, and it was a launch title for the PlayStation 2. So I remember the PlayStation 2 having a pretty crappy launch in terms of its launch titles, but I think looking back I appreciate it more than I did at the time. Street Fighter EX3 launch game, that's a big launch title if you're a fighting game fan. It also had Tekken Tag Tournament as a launch title, so two absolutely massive fighting games. Two kind of non-traditional entries in those series though, which I think we'll see as we look more at this. So this is the third EX game. We've had Street Fighter EX. We looked at EX plus Alpha, which was the PlayStation release of EX, but it was Street Fighter EX. Then we've also looked at Street Fighter EX2. They were both on the PS1. And then this, the third game in the X series, is the first Street Fighter game to hit the PlayStation 2. It was a launch title, so of course it was. So this is a game that's got a very similar visual style to the previous EX games. It's made by the same developer, Eureka, so again, not developed by Capcom, and not technically part of the Street Fighter canon. It's a non-canon game. So yeah, it's an Eureka production, and you'll recognise a lot of the characters. And let's talk about the characters, because this is a bit of an odd one. There's no new characters in Street Fighter EX3. That's not completely true. There's one new kind of character thing, but overall, there's no new characters added to this, which is really disappointing. Really, really disappointing. And one of my favourite things about picking up new entries in Street Fighter series is additions to the character roster, and you always get new additions to the character roster, even across the same games. So across Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 and Hyper Street Fighter 2, and they add in new characters. This is a new game. This isn't like a new version of EX or EX2. This is a brand new game with brand new graphics, everything, just no new characters. I think that's pretty crummy. So it's a very, very similar character roster to EX2. In fact, they've lost some characters. We haven't got Akuma in this. They've taken out Akuma. Unbelievable. But yeah, as I said, there is one kind of new character, and that's this character called Ace, who when you start the game is a completely generic. He's got no special moves, and the point of him is you create your own character through Ace using the character edit mode in the game. And when we look at the game modes, I'll explain that more. But he's not really a new character. He's a blank slate that you add moves to, that you unlock, and you kind of create your own character. So I don't really count him as a new character. So if you look up review scores for EX3, if you look up its Metacritic score and old reviews, you can find some old reviews online. It wasn't loved at the time, and I don't think it's loved in retrospect either. I think it's generally considered as quite an average game in the Street Fighter series, which is a shame, but I kind of understand it. I don't like to be too negative about the Street Fighter games, and I think as the series goes on and we get closer and closer to modern day, it'll probably get slightly more and more negative. But that's not for any joy of being negative. I don't like to do that. I think Street Fighter EX3 is a game that's got a lot of limitations, and maybe it was rushed for the launch of a console. It certainly feels like that could be the case. No new characters and no massive gameplay changes. But anyway, it's a game with faults, and we'll talk about the faults. But first of all, let's talk about some of the things that are new. So the main new addition to the game really is kind of the whole way that the single player or the story, the campaign, the arcade mode plays. So in a traditional Street Fighter game, you'll have an arcade mode like you would at the arcades. It's you fighting 8 to 12 characters until you get to a boss, which is normally M. Bison or Akuma, and you fight them and you win. It's kind of got that, but every match, they're not one-on-one matches. So some Street Fighter games have this thing called dramatic mode, which is like multi-person matches. So you'll have like 2-on-2 or 3-on-2. Not always tag matches, like literally 2 people at the same time or 3 people at the same time. And Street Fighter EX3 really leans into that. So the very first fight that you have in the main mode of the game, which is called Original Mode, the very first match you have is you against 3 opponents at the same time. So you're fighting 3 opponents. So there's 4 characters on screen all at once, which is crazy. It's weird. The game does have a tag mechanic. If you play the modes where you select 2 characters, you can swap in and out by pressing heavy punch and heavy kick at the same time. So similar to the Marvel games, it has a tag mechanic, and similar to Tekken Tag Tournament, which I say came out the same day as this. So that's 2 games both launching with a tag mechanic. You can tell those 2 games came post Marvel vs. Capcom 2. I tried to make it really clear in the last video how influential and important Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was. I think we're starting to see the results of that. Every game had a tag mechanic from now on. So yeah, this original mode is what they call it. It's kind of the main mode in the game. Most of the fights are multi-person fights. Once you win a fight, it'll offer you to take on the person you've just beaten as part of your team. So you build a little team as you get through it, and then when you finally get to the boss, you choose. You've built this big this roster of 4 characters, and you use them all to fight the boss. And then you eventually unlock a character. It's odd. It's not typical, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I like it when Street Fighter games take risks. There's so many of the games that I think they're at their best when they're making changes and taking risks. And if there's one thing I can criticise about EX3 is that it doesn't take enough risks. So I don't want to sit here and say that this mode's bad because it's not a typical arcade mode. It's just not as good as a typical arcade mode. I don't know. It's cool, but it feels like a side mode. In any other game, this would be like an extra mode. It's a bit of a shame that it's the main mode. So the character edit mode, back to Ace. Remember Ace, the generic guy that you unlock moves for? The character edit mode is fairly simple. You've got a few options. Number one is a series of missions that the game gives you. So it's most simple. It's block these attacks, or execute a throw, or do 30 points of damage in one combo, etc., etc. When you complete those little missions, you get points, and then you can spend those points on special moves, which you can give to Ace, and then at any point you can go in and edit the moves, so you can create the Ace that you want to create. Give him the moves that you want. It's a cool little side thing for the game. Like if you're generally a single player, and this was obviously at the time when there was no online modes in fighting games, which is a massive part of fighting games these days, and it's a big part of fighting game revival. You were only playing local competitive at this point, so it's kind of a cool little addition for people who were just playing on their own. But I don't know, Ace is kind of crappy. I'm not in love with the mode. I would rather have more handcrafted original characters than Ace and me having to create. So you can also, of course, set up versus matches, whether it's versus the computer or versus a friend. And you can have tag matches, you can have team battles. You know, it's got those options, but the game doesn't have a traditional arcade mode, one-on-one arcade mode. And for me, somebody who loves Street Fighter as a very balanced, you know, traditional fighting game, I think that's a big loss. It's a massive loss, and it's something that Street Fighter 5 that released 2016, I think that ran into the same problems. That didn't launch with an arcade mode, and people hated that. You know, as much as we want to see new things in Street Fighter, at least have the classic mode that we all like, and then add stuff on top of that. So one interesting thing about these tag matches and these multi-person matches is that if you owned a multi-tap and 4 controllers for your new PlayStation 2, if you'd basically gone out and spent loads of money on your new console, you can play these matches 4-player. You can plug in 4 controllers, and you and 3 friends can all play at the same time. You know, not tagging in and out, literally on screen at the same time. That's quite cool. That's a new thing that we haven't seen in Street Fighter before. You know, we've seen fights that have got 4 people, and we've seen fights that have got 6 people in, but they're usually tag matches. They're usually only 2 people on screen at once. So this, to have 2-on-2 simultaneous, I think that's pretty cool. So looking back at EX3, in retrospect, it's difficult to understand why it wasn't seen as so exciting at the time. But if I can explain it, how I remember this, and I think how it was seen by a lot of people. This came out less than a year after Soul Calibur released on the Dreamcast, and you know, the Dreamcast was a less powerful console than the PS2. People loved the Dreamcast, people still love the Dreamcast, but the PlayStation 2 absolutely destroyed it, literally destroyed it. Shortly after the PlayStation 2 came out, Sega announced they were stopping making Dreamcasts. They never made another console again. The PlayStation 2 slaughtered it. Everybody was excited about the PlayStation 2. It was huge. You know, they had trucks and they delivering them to game stores, and people were just taking them out the back of trucks because they couldn't get them into the stores fast enough. It was a huge deal. But the Dreamcast had Soul Calibur, and Soul Calibur was an absolutely monumentous fighting game release. It looked amazing. It played absolutely brilliantly. The gameplay was awesome. We'd never seen a console fighting game that looked like it. It looked tons better than the arcade version, which was just unheard of. You know, at best you were looking at arcade perfect releases before that on the Saturn. This just looked a million times better than the arcade release. It was an unbelievably cool game. And then less than a year later, Street Fighter EX3 released, which is a kind of weird side Street Fighter game where they've kind of crammed in this tag mechanic, and it's not made by Capcom, so it's not even really a proper Street Fighter game, and it just looked bad. Like, we were still playing Soul Calibur at the time, and the idea of playing a traditional, you know, non-threat. I know the visuals are 3D, but it's a 2D fighting game. It was just like, I don't know. It wasn't exciting, and in retrospect, obviously the 2D fighting genre came back in a big way. I think Street Fighter 4 was a big reason for that, which we'll talk about when we look at Street Fighter 4. But at this time, I mean, the Mortal Kombat games were doing the same thing. They were doing 3D graphics with traditional 2D Mortal Kombat gameplay. Nobody cared at all. It was like the lowest point for Mortal Kombat, and I wouldn't say it was the lowest point for Street Fighter, but it was just difficult to get any enthusiasm out of anybody for it. It was all about Soul Calibur, it was all about Tekken, it was all about Virtua Fighter. And in terms of Street Fighter, it was kind of all about Marvel vs. Capcom 2. So that's kind of a personal anecdotal explanation of why this game just didn't make any waves when it released. It just didn't really move the genre forward in a way that Soul Calibur was doing. But I don't want to be too down on it. It's still a Street Fighter game. It's still a good Street Fighter game. This isn't, you know, Street Fighter the movie. This is a relatively good Street Fighter game that's got an interesting cast of characters, although it's got no new characters. I still think the EX roster is quite interesting because it only existed in the EX games. So, you know, although it's missing Akuma, it's still got all of your favourites, and it's got a ton of these new characters that we don't see in the other Street Fighter games, which I think is quite cool. So one last thing that's weird about the game that's worth talking about is when you finish the campaign mode, the original mode, it's got this weird credit sequence where the credits are coming up on screen, and you play this little mini game that's almost like a beat 'em up brawler thing, you know, like a Streets of Rage or a Golden Axe, where there's just tons of enemies coming at you at the same time, and they all die in like 1 or 2 hits, and you're just smashing through them. And meanwhile, there's this guy in yellow trousers there who gets bigger and bigger every time you beat him. So you kill him and he comes back bigger, and then eventually you can only see up to like his knees because he's a giant taking over the screen, and it's weird. I kind of like interesting credit sequences whenever a game's got a weird take on credit sequence, because otherwise you just skip them, don't you? They're terrible. But yeah, it's an odd choice. It's really odd, and it's not like Street Fighter has ever shied away from being odd, but I can't explain it. So there's Street Fighter EX3. There's our first PlayStation 2 game. I'm going to try and avoid PlayStation 2 games because, as I've explained with my footage, I've been struggling to capture them. So sorry if the footage isn't up to the normal standards. Try and make them look as nice and clean as possible as they can be, and this is just full of glitches and graphics errors. So apologies. You can find tons of videos online of Street Fighter EX3 being emulated at like 4K and 60 frames a second. I just cannot work out how those people are doing that. I've got a really, really powerful gaming PC. I'm running the emulator that everyone recommends. It's just full of these weird glitches and I don't know why. So again, apologies, but thank you anyway for joining me. Hope you enjoyed looking at Street Fighter EX3. I believe this is the last EX game that we look at. I don't think there are any more. No, there's no more EX games. So we're not looking at any more of those. So onwards and upwards. And we'll see you next Thursday if you care to join me. All right, bye.